Hey guys, welcome in to this special APUSH Nation weekend edition of the Fireside Chats. Today I'm going to be talking to you guys about some conflicts that developed in the colonial era prior to the French and Indian War, which is really the focal point of the readings that I gave you guys that will generate some conversations that we have for Monday and Tuesday of this coming week. Where we merge the discussion on Native Americans and the Europeans once again is as we hit some of these smaller conflicts that erupt towards the end of the 1600s and the early 1700s. These are really crucial to set up the stage for Monday's discussion on the outbreak of the French and Indian War. And the three conflicts that we're going to talk about are King William's War, that's the first one, King William's War. The second is Queen Anne's War. And the third, you can't make this up, is the War of Jenkins' Ear. So those are our three conflicts I'm going to hit. And I'm going to give you very brief information about them, but here's the overall context to each of the three wars we're going to talk about. First and foremost, the wars that occurred in the colonies, in almost all three cases, were also wars that broke out in Europe. And so the names that they have for the American wars may be different than the wars in Europe. But the theme that runs concurrent here is that if war is breaking out in Europe between these major powers, it's most likely going to break out in the colonies just because of the fact that both or all sides now have a major presence in North America by the end of the 1700s. The wars in Europe spilled over into the colonial period. That's the first and most important major theme about today's lesson. The second is how Native Americans were dragged into conflict against one another due to their alliances with Europeans. Regardless of the relationships per Native American group and per European colony, Native Americans were dragged into war and pitted against one another based on their alliances with the Europeans. Two themes we absolutely want to take away from today. So let's just quickly again start with each war. And I'll start with King William's War. This is a war fought right at the end of the 1600s. I know we're taking a step back in the timeline here, but right at the end of the 1600s, the English and the French fought a small war for control over land bordering modern-day United States and Canada. Remember, the French had most of Canada colonized thanks to Samuel de Champlain and building the city of Quebec. And so French Canada, and specifically Acadia, which is a region and a French colony in Canada, was heavily disputed between the French and the English. And eventually they fought a war over control of Canada. And at the end of King William's War, the resolution was basically the English and the French signed a treaty, and the French were able to maintain most of control of their territories in French Canada. The second conflict I want to talk to you guys about is Queen Anne's War. And Queen Anne's War is significant because it actually involved all three of the major European players involved in North America: the English, the French, and the Spanish. Now in Europe, Queen Anne's War is known as the War of Spanish Succession. You guys may have even learned about this last year. We're going to focus on how this war broke out in the colonies. Now, think back to King William's War, which I just mentioned. England and France were jockeying for position for land over Canada, and that again comes up in Queen Anne's War, which broke out right at the beginning of the 1700s in 1701, and it would last till about 1713. So for about 12 or 11 years or so, the English and the French were once again engaged in conflict over borders involving Canada. And just like in the first war we talked about, the Wabanaki side, again, ally with the French, and the Iroquois ally with the English. Now, what's interesting about Queen Anne's War is that the French actually, in this conflict, fought with the Spanish. Perhaps it was Catholicism, or perhaps it was alliances back in Europe. Whatever the case may be, the French and the Spanish were actually allied against the English. And Queen Anne's War actually spilled over a great deal into the southern colonies due to the fact that Spanish Florida was in such close proximity to the Carolina colonies that, of course, were the English colonies. And one of the real consequences of Queen Anne's War in the southern colonies, after both sides attempted to invade one another. So the Spanish tried to invade into Georgia and the Carolinas, and the English tried to invade Spanish Florida. And while territory didn't exchange hands, The real horror of Queen Anne's War in the South was the fact that the English really destroyed and wreaked havoc on the Spanish native allies in that region, to the point where they essentially blew up most of the missionary networks that the Spanish had been building in Spanish Florida. And the death toll towards Native Americans in Queen Anne's War was extremely high in the South. And the treaty that ended Queen Anne's War is actually somewhat significant. So the name I need to give you guys, it's the Treaty of Utrecht, which is actually a Dutch city where the treaty was signed. It's spelled Utrecht. The Treaty of Utrecht. And the Treaty of Utrecht, was really significant in terms of the colonial identities, because while it didn't affect anything in the South, the French gave up some ground to the English, and the English got the colony of Newfoundland, which is part of Canada today, and that became part of the British Empire, while they also gained some territory in North Canada near the Hudson Bay. So the French actually lost some land to the English in Queen Anne's War. But again, the real devastation came on the Native American sides, especially in the South. So once again, that theme of natives being dragged into European conflicts with devastating effects. And the last war I want to talk about is the War of Jenkins' Ear. One of probably the coolest names in military history, although there's nothing cool about what happened here, because roughly 20,000 British sailors and soldiers died in this conflict. Now, the name of the War of Jenkins' Ear is actually a really interesting story. By the beginning of the 1730s, it seemed as if Britain and Spain, France would actually sit this one out, by the way. So this was just Britain and Spain, but tension was really high between them. And so a captain of a British merchant ship named Robert Jenkins actually was boarded. His ship was boarded by some Spanish sailors. And during a little brouhaha on the ship, legend has it that the Spanish cut off Jenkins' ear. And the ear eventually, somehow, legend has it again, was given to Parliament. And here's a quote from Jenkins I'm going to read from you because it's kind of interesting. And this becomes sort of the stuff of legends. And Jenkins says that a Spanish captain, I'm just reading it off the thing, took hold of his left ear and with his cutlass slid it down, and then again another of the Spaniards took hold of it and tore it off, but gave him the piece of the ear again. So Jenkins was left with a small piece of his ear, and again, some historians claim that the Spanish sent the ear as a message to the English. Others say that it was Jenkins who delivered the ear to Parliament to set off a conflict. Who the heck knows precisely how they got the ear, or if they even got the ear in the first place. But seriously, think about it. This little thing right here sets off a war that lasts from 1739 to 1748 with devastating effects towards the British especially. The British wound up losing roughly 20,000 men and almost 400 ships in this war. And the Spanish lost close to 5,000 men in this war that, again, was fought over in Europe along with fought in the colonies. And the heaviest toll of the War of Jenkins' Ear was fought in Spanish Florida and Georgia. The French, again, was out of this war. They did not participate on the side of the Spanish as they had done in Queen Anne's War. And the British, on numerous attempts, tried to attack the Spanish colony of St. Augustine and other cities or towns in Florida. Meanwhile, James Oglethorpe, the governor of Georgia, newly created Georgia, wound up fighting off the Spanish in his colony. Again, Native Americans heavily involved in each of these conflicts, just like War of Jenkins' Ear, they were as well. And the real shame of it was, despite the fact that the Native Americans participated, in all three cases, they were never factored into the treaties that ended the war. So whether it was the Treaty of Utrecht that ended Queen Anne's War, or the treaty that ended the War of Jenkins' Ear, which you don't need to know the name of that, regardless, the Native Americans were not ever taken into consideration. And that will really drive home another factor we'll talk about with the French and Indian War. Still to this day, by the way, War of Jenkins' Ear is celebrated on the final day of May. Oh, somebody must be at the door. The final day of May in the city of Savannah, Georgia. So that's it for today, guys. I'll see you guys in class on Monday. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great rest of your weekend.